The International Air Transport Association, IATA, says that African airlines are expected to post a loss of $638 million in 2022. According to the latest outlook by IATA, this will narrow to a loss of $213 million in 2023. The association says that this year there was passenger demand growth of 27.4% amongst African airlines, which outpaced capacity growth of 21.9%. IATA expects that in 2023, the African region will serve 86.3% of pre-financial crisis demand levels and reach around 83.9% of pre-financial crisis capacity in October this year. Now, African airlines, which account for about 1.9% of the global air cargo market, saw cargo volumes decrease by 8.3%, and that's compared with October 2021. For IATA, this was a significant drop from the 0.1% growth that was recorded in September 2022. Furthermore, cargo capacity shrank to 7.4% below October 2021 levels. Well, to make sense of some of this, we're now joined by Aviation Analyst and Managing Director for Plane Talking, Linden Birns. Linden, thanks very much indeed for joining us. This outlook by IATA, what does it tell us? The airlines were struggling a little bit even before COVID, and COVID just was damage. So if we take out the COVID equation, where are we, do you think, in terms of a trajectory that would have been? And then we'll talk about a post-COVID era.
Sure. Hi, and good evening to everybody. I think the important thing to remember is that the drivers that underpin commercial air transport in Africa have not diminished one moment. We're still sitting with the same realities in that we have a growing population. We're still on track to add another 1.5 billion people to Africa's populace by 2030. We still have very rapidly urbanizing cities and economic centers, and they're still largely disconnected by road or rail or river network. So the fastest, the most efficient, the safest way of moving people and goods between markets on the continent is by air. So I think, over the long term, the outlook still remains pretty robust. We'll probably look at growth averaging still around 5.5% compound over the next 20 or so years. I think we'll obviously see a higher growth rate initially because we're coming off this low COVID base because COVID wiped everything out. So initially we're going to see a sharp return, which we have been seeing, certainly on the demand side. And if we look at the continent, we break it down into 4 sub-regions. We're already seeing, for instance, that North Africa and West Africa, the traffic demand has already surpassed 2019 pre-COVID levels. In East Africa, it's within about 4%. But in Southern Africa, we're lagging behind about 33% behind. And we've got our own reasons for that, primarily to do with the downsizing of South African Airways, the exits of Mango, SA Express, Kulula, and BA Comair, which all took a lot of capacity out of the market, and Air Namibia as well. So that goes some way to explaining why our traffic levels haven't yet recovered to the same rate that they have in other parts of the continent. I think what also needs to be kept in mind is that although the demand is there, the profitability isn't yet there, and that remains some way off. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, even going into COVID, we had a situation where a lot of airlines on the continent were in a very poor financial health. A lot of them were very weak, especially many of the state-owned carriers. There were one or two exceptions like Ethiopian Airlines, but generally speaking, they were quite weak. Pardon me. And then on top of that, we've got a situation where during COVID, airlines were appealing, and we had bodies like IATA and the Airlines Association of Southern Africa and the African Airlines Association, all pleading with governments for some form of relief for airlines, not necessarily bailouts, but relief in the form of waivers on taxes and charges and things like that. Those never materialized. So what happened was that the airlines that are still around because they incurred a lot more debt during COVID. So they're struggling now to pay off that debt. They've got to do that, but they're doing it in an environment where we now have inflation, and we have treasuries trying to mitigate the inflationary impact on our economies by raising interest rates on borrowing. So the airlines have been hit by that as well.
Linden, I was at the airport just yesterday and looking for my boarding gate on the big screen, and I was struck by the number of budget type airlines that are now doing most of the flying. Has there been a permanent reset in your view that this is the kind of flying that we'll be doing going forward?
I think it's, again, something else that happened during COVID, and we as much as we either love it or hate it, is the advent of video conferencing. And that has certainly had an impact on the number of people who travel for business. I don't necessarily mean people who fill up the business class cabin, but people who are traveling for business reasons. We definitely have seen a softening in that market because, after all, you can have a business meeting on Zoom, but you can't go on holiday on Zoom. So we're still seeing a high demand. This demand we're seeing at the moment is largely leisure travel and what we call visiting family and relatives travel. So people who are looking to get together with their loved ones if there's been, if there's a wedding or a birth or a death or something to celebrate or commemorate. And to come back to your question about have we seen a reset? I think in our market we probably have seen a move towards that because people's disposable income is limited and it's under a lot more pressure than it was before. But at the same time, the airlines are looking to maximize their efficiency, strip out any costs that are unnecessary, and then if passengers want to pay for things like an in-flight meal, then they will charge them for that. There's obviously also this trend happening worldwide where airlines are looking to extract revenue from what they call ancillary services. That's for things like charging you when you want to pre-reserve a seat or a particular type of seat, for checking in luggage, those sort of things. So these are practices that I think some airlines are going to try and take on board. We're certainly seeing them here with the budget carriers, but there is still a requirement and certainly enough demand for the full service airlines as well. And we certainly see that here with carriers like Airlink, for example.
Let's chat a little bit about cargo. Like you said, you can Zoom a meeting, but cargo still has to move from A to B. And I'm just wondering why we haven't seen that growth in the cargo market. Is it about capacity? Is it using the underbellies of passenger planes as opposed to dedicated cargo freighters?
So I think, again, there are a couple of factors that have come into this. During COVID, when the passenger traffic was pretty much moribund, then we saw a huge pickup in the cargo market. All those dedicated cargo freighters were being pressed into service and high utilization. And we saw a lot of passenger aircraft being converted temporarily into freighters. What we're seeing now is obviously a return of passenger aircraft to meet this growing demand for passenger travel, and the shift back to using the belly space. Now, in addition to that, you've got the slowdown in the manufacturing sector, especially the sort of goods that do get transported by air. So the kind of goods that go as air cargo are either highly perishable items like cut flowers and fresh fruit, or they tend to be high value, low weight, low volume items like electronics and mobile phones. And with China having been and still largely shut down and the manufacturing bottlenecks that we've seen coming out of and impacting on the electronics sector, especially on mobile phones, etc., that has had a huge impact on cargo volumes. We're seeing a softening of cargo rates, and generally it's also reflecting the overall economic climate that's gripped the world ever since Russia invaded Ukraine. Now, the other factor that, of course, is affecting the industry in all of its elements is fuel and energy costs. Fuel especially, because jet fuel at the moment, although crude oil has come down and we're now currently sitting at about, $75, $76 a barrel, the price of jet fuel has remained quite high, and it's still at about $138, $139 a barrel. And historically, there was a $20 crack or gap between the cost of crude oil and the cost of jet fuel. And that represented the cost of refining and distributing the fuel. But what we've seen is that gap has widened to almost $50 over the last 8-9 months. And that's a signal that the refineries are starting to have been limiting production in order to keep their prices high. So they're making an absolute packet. But the airlines and everybody else who use air transport are obviously paying a higher price.
Looking forward, we see new players coming in. I wonder if we'll see even more, or is this for the brave? And then what lessons can be learned? I mean, when you see Air France coming together with Lufthansa, one might not have thought about that 20 years ago, but it happened. Are we going to see African airlines, maybe even national airlines, working together to go forward?
It's a very interesting thing, this idea of cooperation, collaboration, and what form does it take? First of all, you've got issues where you have competition law, and you also may have restrictions. A lot of countries apply restrictions on foreign ownership of airlines. And we have that here in South Africa, for example. So it's difficult to try and attract foreign investment in an airline and to try and have mergers and acquisitions. It was easier in Europe, or it is easier in Europe, because they all exist under one jurisdiction. So for Air France and KLM to get together, or for Lufthansa and Swiss and Austrian to get together, it's relatively easy. The other thing in Africa is that access to markets is also still regulated. Within South Africa, we deregulated. If you've got a license, you can fly anywhere as long as you meet the safety thresholds. But to fly beyond the borders of South Africa requires a bilateral agreement or a number of bilateral agreements, and those prescribe the type of market access. They tell you who can fly, where you can fly to, how often you can fly to, and how many seats a week can be put into the market. So it's artificially constrained. But all of these things need to change if we're going to try and have mergers, acquisitions, or anything more than just an alliance of airlines in Africa. And even then, that wouldn't be something novel. It's been tried and tested before. We had it in between Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya back in the 60s and 70s with East African Airways. We had it in West Africa with Air Afrique. And we even tried it here with South Africa, Tanzania, and Uganda about 15 years ago with an airline called Alliance. And unfortunately, what happened was that you had disparate and diverging agendas and priorities, and ultimately clashes between the shareholders and disagreement, and on all three of them, that they fell victim to different national agendas, if you like.
All right, Linden, we're going to have to leave it there, but it's clear, as you said at the beginning, the drivers for growth are there. It's just finding the solutions to make that work. Thanks so much indeed for your insights as always. All right, that's Linden Birns, who's an aviation analyst and managing director of Plane Talking, talking to us about the losses that are projected for African Airlines in 2022. But it does look as if we'll make progress in 2023 going forward with that loss shrinking.